Watch Federal Post. Bold and independent. अस्सलाम वालेकुम, मैं हूं हसन जफर और आप देख रहे हैं फेडरल पोस्ट। हमारे साथ इस वक्त मौजूद हैं जनाब जावेद हसन साहब। जावेद हसन साहब के बारे में आपको बता दूं, लिखते हैं अरब न्यूज़ में ऑन इकोनॉमिक्स और चेयरमैन रहे हैं नेशनल वोकेशनल टेक्निकल ट्रेनिंग ट्रेनिंग कमीशन के, जो कि एक फेडरल गवर्नमेंट का हमारा इदारा है, और एक थिंक टैंक के चेयरमैन रहे हैं जिसका नाम था इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजरी ग्रुप। और उसके साथ इन्वेस्टमेंट बैंकिंग में तजर्बा है जावेद हसन साहब का, और ही अंडरस्टैंड्स पाकिस्तान इकोनॉमी फ्रॉम वेरियस एंगल्स। तो जावेद हसन साहब, वेलकम एंड गुड टू सी यू अगेन। एक्चुअली हमारी पहले बात हुई थी।
Zafar Saab, it's a pleasure to see you again, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. So let's start with your article today in Arab News. इसका caption बहुत interesting है. It reads, "Zombie annihilation, creative destruction is necessary for Pakistan's industrial revival." So ज़रा हमारे सुनने वालों को बताइए कि इससे क्या मुराद है आपकी, ये zombie annihilation से, और तो ये creative destruction क्या है?
अच्छा, ये कॉन्सेप्ट है काफी पुराना वैसे। इसको पॉपुलराइज करा था एक इकोनॉमिस्ट है, ऑस्ट्रियन इकोनॉमिस्ट, नोबेल लॉरिएट है, शुम्पेटर, जोसेफ शुम्पेटर। एंड ये ऑस्ट्रिया के फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर भी रह चुके हैं। एंड इनने ड्यूरिंग 1930s 1939 में he was looking at business cycles, and he came up with this idea of there's something called creative destruction, and he was really looking at business cycles. उसमें ये था कि at some point businesses need to face real challenges. Capitalism basically is a process of obsolescence and innovation. और बिजनेस साइकिल्स में ये होता है कि आप नए चीजें क्रिएट करते हैं, कुछ दिनों के बाद एब्सोल्यूट हो जाती हैं, फिर वो उनको जाना पड़ता है, रिसेशन आता है, रिसेशन में ये जो एब्सोलेसेंस जहां हो जाती है वो बिजनेसेस खत्म हो जाते हैं, नए बिजनेसेस आते हैं, इनोवेशन होती है, नई टेक्नोलॉजी आती है। तो दैट्स हाउ बिजनेस साइकिल्स हैपन. So that is very important, and we have seen this across the world. If you think about the Reaganite and Thatcherite revolutions in Britain and in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yes.
It was basically you were facing very low productivity growth, obsolescent industries. You are basically seeing high inflation, कोई इम्प्रूवमेंट नहीं हो रही थी, यूनियन की बड़ी ज्यादा पावर थी. So basically these two leaders had to adopt a very tough set of measures, which led to initially, in the initial phase, recession. Both the countries, United States and UK, faced severe recession. In that, if you think about it, आपने तो सुना ही होगा, Rust Belt का सुना होगा. Large sections of industry were wiped out, including in energy. Coal got wiped out. Basically all industry, auto sector suffered a lot. But what happened was, yes, it was very painful. Lots of unemployment happened. There was social disruption.
It was very unpopular in Britain in those days, Thatcherism, because उन्होंने ट्रेड यूनियंस पे पाबंदी लगा दी थी और डीरेगुलराइज किया था. हमें याद है उस जमाने में वो GNER ट्रेन्स चलती थी, फिर ये वर्जन ट्रेन्स आ गई. So all the sectors were public sector.
I used to be a student, and I'll be very honest, I did not like Thatcher at all. So most of the young people very anti-Thatcher, and we've never really found her very popular. But it has to be said, the industrial landscape of Britain and America changed a lot.
Indeed.
And they had
the north and east division in Britain, वो जो north और east में divide किया था, the working class was moved into the north, and the affluent class occupied the south of England. So that kind of social division also, yes.
So social changes, mobilization, lots of people आपकी ग्रोथ ऑफ द सिटी हुई, टेलीकॉम्स में बहुत ज्यादा ग्रोथ हुई, बायोटेक्नोलॉजी में न्यू इंडस्ट्रीज केम अप वेरी सडनली. So, and since then, you have seen a sustained period of growth until at least from sort of mid 80s to about 2008. We saw continuous, very sustained growth, both in terms of living standards and earnings per capita.
Yeah.
So, and that really captured the essence of creative destruction, where you basically have a recession which leads to many of the old industries going out, exiting. You have new industries coming, you have new training, you have redeployment of resources. This is one case. The other case, if you want to think in much more extreme case, was in East Asia in late 1997, where you saw the East Asian financial crisis, where you saw phenomenal growth in the East Asia. And then after that, you saw a collapse in 97, 98, where it was really driven by misallocation of resources by the banks and the financial companies. And many of the banks faced bankruptcy. And because of that, overall economic collapse, there was 5 to 10% in many cases. The GDPs contracted from South Korea to Thailand to Indonesia, Malaysia, almost every country in South, there was a cloud hanging over. And that was a very, very painful period. They had to go through restructuring. But then again, there also some companies survived, smaller, more nimble companies grew. There was innovation, they became more efficient. And since then, we have seen almost sustained growth in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
So interestingly, this is not something only you were thinking capitalist economies. Creative destruction very much happens even in China. They very much allow bad companies. If you see unke public sector mein, which used to be something like 80% of the industrial landscape, now less than 20% of their industrial landscape is public sector. Many of their steel mills, many of their coal industry, much of their sort of heavy industries which were in the public sector basically were allowed to close down, and they were replaced by much more efficient, nimble private sector companies. Abhi aap dekhiye, Evergrande is a very large property sector company. It was allowed to go bust. So there's constant allowing of market forces to bring about this churn in business. And what sometimes it does mean is that you have very painful periods in the economy where you have recession. Now, I look at Pakistan, and I've seen in Pakistan I've been observing Pakistan since sort of early 90s, and I've seen virtually the same business groups, the same businesses, almost continuously being present. And there seems to be no change. Now, that must be very odd. But one thing also, which with another colleague and friend of mine who's also part of the economic advisory group, which I mentioned, they did a report, Ahmed Pirzada and his colleagues, and it's called Stick in the Mud. And Pakistan is the stick in the mud, which is one which has performed badly. They looked at productivity growth from 1999 to 2018. Or Pakistan productivity growth on a compounded average basis annually from 1999 to 2018, effectively 30 years, was only 0.7% once it's adjusted. 0.7% annually growth, productivity growth.
उसका जो aggregate है, average जो है निकलता है वो
average overall in that period it grew by something like 45%. Okay.
Right.
India's growth in that same period annually was 4.3%.
Wow, that's substantial.
Now, and China's growth in the same period annually was 8.3%.
Right. So from the picture, yes, please continue. I'll complete it.
So basically, what it's saying is Pakistan mein, there's been very little improvement in productivity of our industrial base. जब productivity नहीं improve होगी, and when your competitors are improving their productivity all the time, how will you compete?
Regional competitors, you are talking
regional
about
competitors.
India and China.
India, China, Bangladesh, even Bangladesh grew by annually something, precise number, I think it's about 2.6% annually.
That's not bad either.
Yeah. And we have grown virtually at nothing. And even where we have grown is
Why
in the
is
same
that?
industries.
Begs the question, why is that?
Now, this is the difficult question. And I think it all comes to the political economy.
Right.
You have basically in Pakistan sort of a class of people who set policies, who make sure the policies are in favor of them. So there's a mixture of, subsidy, protection, concessionary financing, regulatory hurdles. So there's very few exit and entry barriers. There are lots of entry barriers. There are quite a few exit barriers as well. So essentially, few people are allowed to come in to compete. Those who are in there, somehow or the other, profits are funneled towards them through these means of subsidy or protection or regulatory requirements. So essentially, the same groups, the same large industrial groups, keep making money without ever having to work harder. And this has gone on so if you can continue being profitable without necessarily having to run harder and harder, why should you need to innovate?
Right. So what I understand, that one is this political interference or a political class's upper hand
Patronage.
in decision making.
Yeah.
And that means that the subsidies are granted to those sectors of economy or of society uh, which we recognize as the elite.
बिल्कुल
ठीक है
बिल्कुल
तो इसके अंदर इसके अच्छा so it is compounded by another factor, that is the government regulation over various things that compromises the ease of doing business in this country. Is that right?
indeed. And those regulations very often favor the incumbent players.
Right.
So
So
it
this is
becomes very
not,
difficult to enter.
as I've been thinking about it, this is not typically a question of economics then. It is more of a question of politics or political economy, if you like to say, as you said it. So how do we move forward in this? Okay, let me bring up a scenario, the current scenario. अभी जो हमारे foreign minister हैं, Ishaq Dar साहब, who was previously in charge of all financial affairs. उसके बाद जो है IMF जो है जो यहाँ पे औरंगजेब साहब हैं, who I don't know if you know him very closely because he also has the background in investment banking, like yourself.
I've met him. He's a fine banker indeed.
Must be. और तो वो उनका जो IMF के साथ इस वक्त हुआ है अंडरस्टैंडिंग, उन्होंने कहा है कि ये जो 469 बिलियन रुपीस के हमारे ड्यूज हैं सीपैक वाले, वो आप इस पैसों में से अदा नहीं करेंगे जो आपने IMF से लिए. सो आपके फॉरेन मिनिस्टर जो हैं उनके साथ इन विद अ व्यू ऑफ improving relations as well as taking the CPAC thing forward. और दूसरी तरफ आपके फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर जो हैं वो IMF के साथ बात कर रहे हैं और एग्री कर रहे हैं कि हम ये इसमें CPAC के अंदर हम कोई फर्दर इसमें से पैसे यूज नहीं करेंगे. How do you see this?
So Zafar Sahab, if I may, I'm not too sure. वैसे अगर from my understanding वो promise नहीं करा गया है to IMF, ना IMF ने demand करा. That is my understanding. I can't confirm it, but that would be a very unusual thing where IMF says you can't use the balance of payments money to make because effectively whatever IMF support gives, it's for balance of payments purposes. So it would be very difficult to imagine that they put a restriction there. I think that we have to be very precise. All I'm saying is I'm not too sure if that is true. But the fact of the matter is we have now a compounding of debt repayments to make. Just in the next 3 months, apparently we have to make something like $10.8 billion, उसमें से कुछ तो रोल ओवर हो जाएगा, but apparently we still need to make about $4.8 billion of payments.
Hmm.
Now, we just have in our kitty right now in our state bank reserve something like 8 billion, and we will get another 1.1 billion from IMF at the end of April. So if you imagine you add that, we'll still be left, we'll only be left with something like 4.3, 4.4 billion at the end of June. And after that, we have another approximately 20 billion payments to make. Look, and this is before we talk about the payments we need to make to CPEC, which, as you said, it's about $1.8 billion, and that will be, there'll be further accruals there. So अब जो है हम लोग का गहरा जो है, the circle is getting tighter, and it is becoming increasingly difficult. So we are having to beg, borrow, and steal from everywhere, and pretend that somehow or the other keep this railroad running. But this railroad cannot go on, because I tell you, fundamentally the problem is all the finance ministers and all the bankers and all these see this as a liquidity problem. It is not really it is a liquidity problem we are facing, undoubtedly. But fundamentally, what we are facing is a structural problem in our industrial and productive base.
And
We simply
what is that problem exactly? What is that structural problem? Like, if you have to define it for a student,
the
how
simple
do you
problem is
explain
that,
it? What is that
very
structural
simple,
problem? Yes.
there is virtually very few industries, and I struggle to name many. There are very few industries that if you remove either subsidy or protection, which will be able to compete in the international sphere, which will be able to sell your products internationally to earn dollars. So it's either by protection or by subsidy of different forms, whether it's concessionary financing, or whether it's electricity subsidy, or it is gas subsidy, or it's some kind of other form of subsidy, that, or you get protection. Let's take an example, auto sector, which has been around for last 40 years. You have had protective duties initially as high as 150%. Over a period, it has come down. It's still around 45% on average, or 50%.
Yeah.
And so any of these assemblers, if you were to remove the protective duty, they would all go bust immediately.
Right. Yeah.
Same, I would say, is the steel industry. Now, if you imagine that most of these industries are basically there because of either protection or subsidy, who is paying for it? It's either you or I.
Definitely.
Or
Someone
the
is
state.
always paying
Yeah.
for the subsidy given to any sector.
And you have to imagine, you and I and the government effectively are the state. So if I'm paying for it through having higher pay, that means our other businesses, the downstream businesses, are inefficient because there's a higher input cost. Same with steel industry. So basically, we have created distortions in the economy where just about everything, because we have tried to keep some businesses alive, some industrial groups to keep going. So we have now created a system where we are having to borrow more and more from others so that we can keep some of the groups and some of the businesses going. And that program has expanded. So I almost shudder that we will get further loans to keep these businesses going for a few more years, because all we'll be doing is compounding our problem. No one is trying to becoming more efficient. And that is fundamentally the problem. So everyone thinks about it in terms of somehow or the other that this is only a liquidity problem. No, it isn't a liquidity problem. Yes, there is a liquidity issue, but the liquidity problem is a symptom of a much more underlying issue, which is your structural inefficiency of the industrial base, your productive base. And that productive base is inefficient, or is because you were your growth of productivity was growing at 0.7% or near zero, when your competitors in the region were growing at, in the extreme case, at 8%, and even your next door neighbor at 4.3%. They
Right.
were getting more and more efficient. They were able
So
to
this
produce more.
gap is widening. This gap is widening increasingly and
Yeah.
painfully too. Uh, one very simple question I would like to ask and like to understand: the money that we borrow from the IMF, this this installment of $1.1 billion that we
Yeah.
are negotiating right now, what happens with that money? Does it all go into debt servicing, or
Effectively, yes.
does
We
it
are now in a classic.
stay in our pocket for some time and make the current account deficit look better in some ways?
No, no, it doesn't. We are in a classic debt trap now.
Okay.
If
And
you,
what do we mean
if
by
you
classic debt trap?
is basically you're borrowing to pay off old borrowings.
All right.
So imagine you were basically, and I'm sure Zafar Sahib, you're nothing like that. You had three credit cards,
I never had
and
one actually.
I know, I'm sure you don't. You're a reasonable person, and your home economics is much better than Pakistan's overall economics. But if you had, for just argument's sake, if you had three credit cards and you were maxed out on each of those credit cards, and then you went on for a fourth credit card so you could pay off the interest payments on the three credit cards, and that's where we are. We have basically now maxed out. We can't go to the market because the market doesn't give us access. We can't go to international bond markets. They won't trust us to give us money. So we are now just asking IMF some more money. Then we beg, borrow, and steal from friendly countries who are now increasingly reluctant to give us money. So now we'll have to sell our household silver to so that we can get a bit of money to keep the liquidity going. And
This
all
sounds
the
like a
while,
story of many individuals I have known personally, around. वो यही करते हैं, वो किसी और से पैसे लेके किसी और का उधार वापस कर देते हैं, फिर उनका कर देते हैं, एंड देन कोई बच्चों की शादी आ गई, ईद वगैरह आ गई, तो फिर दे बोरो मोर मनी फ्रॉम हियर एंड देयर. सो ये दिस इज वेरी मच अंडरस्टैंडेबल, और मेरा ख्याल है हमारे सुनने वाले भी बहुत अच्छी तरह रिलेट कर सकते हैं इस सारे मॉडल को, कि जो हमारे यहाँ माइक्रो लेवल पे यानी पर्सनल लेवल पे जिस तरह लोग अपनी इकोनॉमी चला रहे हैं, वैसी मुल्क की भी हालत है.
I like to think पर्सनल लेवल पर काफी लोग बेहतर चला रहे हैं बनिस्बत हम लोग जिस तरीके से मुल्क चलाए.
Yes. So,
I,
here is one important thing, important development here. अभी जो आपने देखा, ये 8 फरवरी के इलेक्शन के बाद जो एक और पीटीआई की गवर्नमेंट की एग्जिट के बाद, वो जो इमरान खान साहब का साइफर वाला सारा किस्सा था और डोनाल्ड लू की उसमें इन्वॉल्वमेंट थी. सो नाउ द अमेरिकन कमिटी ऑन a subcommittee of the on foreign affairs, जो पाकिस्तान के रीजन के साथ डील करती है, उन्होंने वहां पे डोनाल्ड लू को, यू नो द होल स्टोरी, उन्हें बुलाया,
yeah.
उनसे सवाल पूछे, और उन्होंने कुछ फरमाइशें की हैं कि पाकिस्तान में एक कमीशन बना के इस जो भी इलेक्शन में हुआ उसको एग्जामिन किया जाए. लेकिन वन थिंग इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट इन रिलेशन टू आवर इकोनॉमी, और जो यहाँ पे SIFC बनी है, उन्होंने कहा है कि अगर आपने ऐसा नहीं किया, इलेक्शन की ये आपने जो भी हुआ है यहाँ पे उसकी इन्वेस्टिगेशन नहीं कराई, तो फॉरेन इन्वेस्टर्स विल बी रिलक्टेंट टू कम एंड इन्वेस्ट इन पाकिस्तान. यानी SIFC जो कि फॉरेन डायरेक्ट इन्वेस्टमेंट को अट्रैक्ट करने के लिए बनाई गई है, उसके ऊपर उन्होंने डायरेक्ट ये अटैक किया एक तरीके
क्वेश्चन मार्क्स करें effectively.
से.
Let me say two things. एक तो I have my concerns that we think by doing structures like SIFC, suddenly there'll be a lot of money. I have known, and I've been following Pakistan for the last 30 years or more.
Yes.
And frankly speaking, अगर कोई $500 million लाता है पाकिस्तान में, कोई bureaucratic restraint नहीं होता है. It is quite easy. So I think there has been a lot made out कि पाकिस्तान में इसलिए नहीं आता है कि ease of doing business नहीं. It is really fundamental problems in underlying structure of competitiveness of the tariff structure. ब्यूरोक्रेसी आराम से हट जाती है, एससीसीपी लॉज आराम से अकोमोडेट कर जाती है, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ फाइनेंस, स्टेट बैंक, सारा कुछ, अगर इतने पैसे आने होते हैं. So I think SIFC or CPEC or not, if your underlying structural base is not competitive, you'll find it very difficult to attract money. The other problem is there has to be what is really relevant here. If, for instance, a large number of investors feel that in reality, the government is not representative of the people, and this is a government which is doesn't have the solid mandate of the populace and the popularity. And if they take the tough measures they take, the people will not be behind it. It is less likely that this government will be able to take the tough measures that it needs to actually restructure the economy, which will make it more attractive to invest in. So one of the main problems is that if you are not confident about that mandate, the chances it affects, investors are very sharp people. They don't simply buy कि आप English अच्छी जाके बोल रहे हैं उनसे और अच्छे nice tie and suit पहन. They really understand what is the underlying reality of that economy. And it's not a question of just democracy. They invest in China as well. But in China has a communist system which is accepted, which has a legitimacy. Every survey shows that 70%, 80% of the population, and quite genuine survey, trust this Communist Party. In India, one of the reasons it is a very functioning democracy. We may not like it. We may not like it, Hindutva. The fact of the matter is we have a system now where there's a question mark on the democracy. And if there is question mark on the mandate and the democracy, I am pretty certain, even if they don't say openly, even some of our friendliest countries will be a bit wary of investing here. And that really is. So what the Congress might be saying very bluntly, many would be saying, keeping that in mind without saying so publicly.
So openly, yes. But here is another dimension to it, that is, कि जहां आपने कहा है कि taking tough measures. Don't you think an unpopular government can really afford to take tough measures, because वो तो पहले ही unpopular है, so there is nothing much to lose. So if they want to take tough measures, let's take tough measures. And that एक जो political तज्जिया है इस मुल्क में of the current government is that कि ये तो इनको लाया ही इसलिए गया कि they were already looking so bad, so they can't look worse anyway. So इनसे जितने काम करवाने हैं ऐसे करवा लें. इन्हें कहा IMF वाली डील कराएं, एक बजट बनाएं, because these are all very unpopular things to do. So and they are forced to do. I don't know, forced to do, but they are there to do this.
I think generally speaking, countries that or economies or governments that don't have the mandate are looking to somehow or the other appease the public. So you can have undemocratic regimes which are resource rich, jahan bahut tel nikal raha hai, so you have hundreds of billions of dollars to throw at the public, and you can do that. Where you have basically, or you go down a very autocratic route. आप लोगों के पकड़ दकड़ करें, बंद कर दें, चिली के तरह tens of thousands लोगों को मार दें, जैसे चिली पिनोशे ने करा था. So you can then have a very, very autocratic. But if you have some degree of freedom and you call yourself a democracy, where people will protest if electricity price is increased by another 30 rupees or 20 rupees per unit, you will find it very difficult to do so, because people will come on the streets. There could be strikes. So it becomes more and more difficult. Like now they are talking about imposing retail tax. अगर वो आपका retail sector बंद करने लगा, वो तो हमेशा करता है. How easy will it be? If you had a popular mandate, you would be so much more comfortable. Now we not only have a difficult mandate, but we have parties in this coalition which have completely contradictory views on very fundamental issues. You have PPP, which doesn't believe in the kind of privatization that
Because
PMLN.
their founding father made it happen ना, तो नेशनलाइजेशन भुट्टो साहब करके गए थे, जुल्फकार अली भुट्टो साहब, तो अब जाहिर है उनको उसको अंडू करने का मतलब तो ये कहना है, तो यू कांट मेक अ स्टेटमेंट कि उन्होंने गलत किया, तो दे हैव
Not
टू।
only that, they have a popular constituency which benefits from these state-owned companies,
उन्होंने
PIA,
बहुत सारे लोग
what
उसमें
have
भर्ती
you.
कराए थे, अपने वर्कर्स को उसमें उन्होंने पीआईए में भर्ती कराया था, और ऑल दिस प्लेसेस।
Then similarly, NFC award की restructuring. Now there is little reason for much of the money that PPP will get is in the province. Why would they want less allocation there? Then you have broadening of the tax base, which will mean both retail and small businesses. Their PMLN would be very wary of doing it. So you have very.
सॉरी, हमारे पास अब 3 मिनट रहते हैं। लेट मी आस्क यू अ क्वेश्चन रिलेटेड टू एनएफसी अवार्ड वेरी क्विकली। वो ये कि अब यहाँ पे ये भी अभी कुछ हिंट दिया है हमारे फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर साहब ने कि अब सूबे जो है, पहले तो ये था ना कि फेडरल गवर्नमेंट इनको एनएफसी के तहत सूबों को पैसे दे देती थी कि भाई ये लें, आप लें और ऐश करें, और उसके बाद दे कुड नॉट टेक द मनी बैक इवन इफ द मनी वाज अनयूज्ड। लेकिन अब उन्होंने कहा कि कुछ ऐसे हिंट्स दिए हैं कि ये पैसे अब आधे देंगे, आधे अब आप खुद ही जनरेट कर लें। हाउ डू यू सी दैट?
I think it will be very interesting how the constituencies or the coalition partners react to it. This will require a amendment, a constitutional amendment. It can't be just done at the whim of the executive body. And I'll be surprised to see how some of the provinces react to this.
Yes, it will be very interesting to see. लेकिन अभी तो वो कह रहे हैं कि हम बहुत गोडी गोडी बहुत हैप्पी हैप्पी हैं टुगेदर, और हमारे बीच में कोई डिफरेंसेस नहीं है। So whatever you say, we will do. That
Well, let's see. It's always nice, and I hope everything works out. But I've very rarely seen when conflicting interests come into it, people are so nice that they give up their own interests so happily.
Javed Hasan साहब,
And that's why.
Please.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, नहीं, आप अपनी बात कंप्लीट कर लिए, वो जो आप जो कह रहे
No, that's why I think to have a strong mandate makes economic reforms so much easier than if you don't have a government with a strong mandate.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Javed Hasan साहब. Pleasure talking to you again. आप लोगों के देखने का बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। इजाजत दीजिए। खुदा हाफिज। पाकिस्तान जिंदाबाद।